It is a great honor to open this important conference at this critical stage in the search for a just and lasting solution to the intractable challenges confronting Israel-Palestine. I want to recognize the enormous contribution that Professor Herbert Kelman has made to the search for peace and for a two-state solution. He will be celebrating his 90th birthday on the 18th of March, the same day as my own 81st birthday. It will also be the 25th anniversary of the results of the referendum in which white South Africans voted overwhelmingly for a peaceful and constitutional solution to our own intractable problems. I would also like to thank Dr. George Assousa for inviting me to participate in this conference. He has dedicated the past 40 years to the search for peace and for a two-state solution, which I support. I have enormous sympathy for Israelis and Palestinians in their search for a just and lasting peace. As an Afrikaner boy, growing up in the Dutch Reformed religion, I was immersed in the Old Testament. I knew about Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth long before I knew about London, New York, or Paris. I grew up with and was inspired by the stories of Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. My people, the Afrikaners, identified closely with the Israelites. We had our own trek into the wilderness in search of a land flowing with milk and honey. We shared the longing of the Jews to rule ourselves in our own land. We also had to fight to preserve our independence in two bitter wars against the British. After the Anglo-Boer War, Britain found itself in possession of a ragbag of vexatious and expensive territories in southern Africa. It decided to establish a system along the lines of the successful federations that it had set up in Australia and Canada. It drew arbitrary lines on the map of southern Africa, just as it would later do in the Middle East, lumping together peoples who had little in common and dividing others. In keeping with the values of the times, Britain gave English-descended whites and the Afrikaners a monopoly of power when it established the Union of South Africa in 1910. For the next 40 years, South Africa developed more or less along the lines of the other Commonwealth dominions. Until the mid-50s, in a continent that was still dominated by European powers, white minority rule in South Africa seemed unexceptional. In a world in which racial discrimination was still shockingly the rule, South Africa's segregation policies elicited little criticism. However, as the tide of imperialism ebbed from Africa during the 1960s, South Africa was left stranded and floundering in the continent's last pool of white rule. Its apartheid policies were quite correctly condemned as an affront to the new international norms of racial equality and non-discrimination. White South Africans found themselves on the back of an increasingly angry and fractious black tiger. The world was shouting at us to dismount, but we had real existential fears. We were being asked to abandon our right to national self-determination. For us, this at the time evoked the same fears that Israelis would have if they were ever asked to accept the end of the State of Israel. Secondly, we were deeply concerned about communist expansionism and its influence in the ANC. Thirdly, we were worried about chaos. Independence in the rest of Africa had not resulted in functioning democracies. Most newly independent states had descended into tyranny, corruption, and economic collapse. So during the 1980s, we searched desperately for solutions. We tried territorial partition in a 10-state solution. We tried reform, but by the mid-1980s, the demand was for a transfer of power. At the end of the 1980s, history opened a window of opportunity for an inclusive constitutional settlement. By 1987, Nelson Mandela had accepted that there would have to be negotiations. In 1988, 50,000 Cuban troops were withdrawn from Angola. In November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the collapse of Soviet communism and signaled the victory of liberal democracy and free market economics. We realized that the circumstances for successful negotiations would never again be so propitious. So on the 2nd of February 1990, we leapt through the window of opportunity and commenced negotiations. During the subsequent 4 years, we succeeded in negotiating a new, non-racial constitution and in holding our first universal elections in April 1994. Against this background, let me address two salient lessons from our experience. The first is that all parties in intractable conflicts must genuinely accept that they cannot achieve their aims through armed force. If one side or the other believes that it has a sufficient preponderance of power, it will be inclined to continue to pursue its objectives through force. Alternatively, it will choose to manage rather than solve the problem, thus avoiding the painful compromises that genuine negotiations always require. The South African government had by the middle 80s accepted that there would have to be a negotiated solution. Although it enjoyed overwhelmingly military superiority, it realized that the balance of forces would shift inexorably against it. By 1987, Nelson Mandela, sitting in prison, had reached the same conclusion, the conclusion that continuing conflict would turn South Africa into a wasteland for everyone, and that the only acceptable option was negotiations. Importantly, both sides entered the negotiations with sufficient power to secure their core interests. The second lesson from our experience was that there could be no solution without justice. An international consensus on what constitutes justice began to develop after World War II. It was based on the self-determination of peoples, the rejection of racial, religious, and gender discrimination, and the promotion of equality. It could be summed up in the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Successful negotiations require that all sides have to make painful compromises. In return, they have to be able to achieve their reasonable core goals. Justice requires win-win outcomes. We chose the road to radical transformation, not because of international pressure or the threat of armed insurrection. We were motivated by the need to find a workable, long-term solution and acceptance that we could not build a secure future based on injustice towards others. We realized that the longer injustice continued, the deeper the bitterness and distrust would become, and the harder it would be ultimately to find mutually acceptable solutions. We also realized that the continuation of injustice would erode our own humanity. Intractable problems are all unique, and it is meaningless to equate the current situation in Israel-Palestine with apartheid. There are fundamental differences between South Africa in the 1980s and Israel-Palestine now. South Africa had no international support whatsoever. None of our opponents questioned our right to exist, and most significantly, we did not have the option of a two-state solution. There were other differences too many to deal with now. There was no part of the country in which white South Africans comprised more than 25% of the population. So we had to opt for a one-state solution. We had to put our trust in a strong constitution for the protection of fundamental rights and the maintenance of democratic institutions. Israelis and Palestinians do have an alternative choice. In one-state solutions, power must, by definition, be shared, and the future will be determined by demographics and by the continuing commitment of all parties to the founding agreements. If I were an Israeli, I would not hesitate. I would opt for a two-state solution. I would make the painful compromises that will be needed to make it work. I would ask myself, what initiative can I take to break the deadlock in negotiations? And I would be worried that the window of opportunity to a two-state solution might be shutting down. In doing so, I would base my decisions on the long-term unacceptability and impossibility of solutions based on force and on the need for justice for all. I thank you.